that this is just kind of an introduction of some of the work that we will be planning out in the next probably a couple of years. And we thought it would be good to start with just a general overview on some of the research. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Diane Terra.
Hi everyone. Well, you know, when I think about, and I get to talk across the country about trauma and trauma-informed practitioners, and sitting here this morning and standing outside earlier, I realized that so much of what we talked about in trauma was symbolized and made evident by our speakers this morning and by all of you throughout the time that we've already been together. I think about the compassion, the vulnerability, the respect for students and their differences and their needs, the creativity that requires, and the camaraderie, the collegial support that is essential to be trauma-informed practitioners was all so brilliantly made here this morning. And so I feel honored to be among you, and I realize now I get to do sort of the sciencey part that isn't quite as fun and isn't as personal as what you've already experienced. So I apologize that I don't know you all better, but I sort of know you via the many educators that I've had a chance to be with across many years, some in Lancaster, PA, I know how to pronounce it, but also across many other states, and my experiences as a new middle school teacher of children with significant emotional disabilities, and the supports that I needed in those early years, and the things that have happened for me throughout my career as I've consulted, as I've been a support to folks in the district that are people like you, working hard, working with each other, creatively, compassionately supporting kids that are often struggling with very hard things or come from hard places. So thank you for allowing me this turn to silence, but please know that it's nested in an awful lot of respect for what it is to be an educator today. So we're going to skip a lot of slides because of our shortened time, and I do need to remember my end point. Somebody will shout it out to me. It's 10:30? 11:30, something like that, right?
11:30, you have 40 minutes.
So, anytime I talk about trauma, I think it's really important, depending on where you are in your own life, the people you're supporting, the kids you're supporting here at work, your own personal lives, trauma can be dysregulating. Conversations around it, even short ones, can sometimes dysregulate us. So, if you need to step up and step away, or if you weren't able to get to the restroom during our break, please feel free to take care of your bodies first and foremost, because our brain relies on our bodies being settled, so please settle yourself as you need. We are not going to have a lot of time for talking with each other, but I'm going to ask for you to take moments, if you're seated near someone, to turn and talk briefly. And I'll ask for folks to shut some things out. If we can do that pretty quickly, that would be nice. I had fun polling stuff planned, but it's not going to happen. And there are some handouts that Shannon put in, but not enough for everybody. If you're somebody who likes notes, I think that might pass those out a little bit. That. So my job is to really recognize not only that you all have a vast wisdom around what kids need, which means you have a great wisdom around trauma. My job is also to make sure that we have some common language. So I'm really going to try to kind of put a pin in some quick definitions of trauma, and then also about 7 physiological realities related to kids with trauma histories, and 4 kind of psychological realities. These are not comprehensive, but they're the ones that I've found that as educators, they're the touch points for us, particularly as we think about challenging behaviors where we're struggling with how to support a kid. If we can go back to these and think about them, they often then give us the answers in terms of the kinds of strategies we want to employ. So we'll be looking quickly, and I'm going to shorten it a little more so, about what are definitions of trauma, what are some key understandings, and then we will go ahead and move into those, the science of stress and the psychology of stress and trauma. So my hope is you're going to walk away feeling affirmed, greatly affirmed. Also, I hope that there may be some things that I'm going to say, or that you'll say when you talk quickly with one another, that bring out things from the attic and unpack them and maybe bring something back into use or a thinking back into use that you already had and tucked away because you haven't had to use it recently. And then finally, I certainly hope that there's some new things that will grow for you as a result of today. And they'll often grow from the roots and the basis that you already brought to the table. This has been informed by, and so I wanted to let you know whose work I tap into. And it includes people like Dr. Bessel, Dr. Bruce Perry, Dr. Linda Harris, psychologists like Dr. James Garbarino, all kinds of Robin Carr-Morris, social worker, all kinds of folks, and also educators. So it's kind of a combination of a lot of folks who've been in conversation with one another across time about how to support kids in educational settings. So this is where you get to turn and talk for a second. When you hear the word trauma, what is something that, like a word or a phrase that quickly bounces into your mind? Don't overthink it. Go ahead and talk to somebody for a moment. Trauma, you will, and some of the definitions, you will kind of, oh, there's a connection, that's what we've been talking about. And if you wanted to shout something out at any point, that's great. So I don't like to talk about trauma in isolation. It certainly is part of the stress trauma continuum. And I'm going to talk about some of the changes that happen in the brain that are related to childhood trauma or pervasive trauma. But many times when we are stressed, any of us as human beings are stressed, we are going to manifest some of those same things. So there's a complete relationship between those two. As we've gone through the years of COVID, we know that a lot of people have moved further to the right. A lot of our students have moved further to the right. Kids that were already kids who have pervasive trauma now have layers of stress upon that. So we know that our job has become progressively more difficult because of that reality. Trauma is the result of either acute or chronic stressors. And I think the really important thing in this statement is without sufficient mitigating factors. So we all experience trauma very uniquely, and it's that balance between those stressors and the factors that can mitigate them. I think it's really important when we talk about trauma that we don't fall into what is an easy trap of it must just be the family, the supporters, the caretakers, the parents are not doing sufficient support for their child, or they are abusive. It's just easy to think about those kids that have had those tough lives. But the thing is, when we think about childhood trauma in its entirety, those are a portion of the kids, and we certainly know that children that are in abusive and neglectful situations are going to have a whole lot of burdens that they carry and a lot of changes to their body and brain. However, there are other kids whose caretakers are doing the very best they can. They're not abusive, but those children may still have changes in their brain and body as a result of the stressors that they experience. So I think about kids, here it's Veterans Day, kids with deployed parents, kids with parents who are dealing with their own mental health issues, kids who were adopted into families but they had childhood trauma experience prior to their adoption, including even in utero. So I think we want to make sure that when we think about trauma, we think about it more broadly and not just in abusive or neglectful situations. When we fit, and you may have listed some things that were events. So a fire is an event, fire this morning. An event that could, for some children, that might have been traumatizing if they'd been here as the children in the building, the students in the building, as opposed to us as adults. An event can be traumatizing. What I've found with so many children is that many traumatic events, so a fire in the home, is a traumatic event for them, but there's a cascading effect of that. Because when I have a fire in the home, then I have to have a new home, and then maybe I nest in with certain people, and I'm not, things change a lot, I change schools. So all these things then cascade, and we've seen many times that children don't simply have a singular event, but in reality, it's what many people in the field call death by 1,000 needles. It is trauma by 1,000 needles. It is that ongoing assault on one's sense of emotional and physical safety. And so that's where there's an intersection between the folks that have really studied the impacts of poverty and being socially disadvantaged with the impacts of trauma, so that poverty is a risk factor. It's not a given, but it's a risk factor for having trauma, because if you're waking up not sure if you'll have enough food for the day, or where you're going to be living next, or who's going to be your caretaker, because I have to find and cobble together caretakers when my child's not in school. All those sorts of things for a child experiencing that kind of drip, drip, drip of ongoing stress that also changes how their body and brain works. It's a little hard to see, perhaps, and you might have it in your handout. There's so many sources, and this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch. There are a lot of potential sources of trauma. Again, it's what's happening that mitigates. And you might be familiar with the ACEs research, which looks at adverse childhood experiences, but the other side, always of ACEs that we should consider, is what are the mitigating factors, what are the supports that children have. And I think today, many of the talks were about how supports make a difference, even when something is highly stressful. I'm going to skip that and just talk about why childhood trauma, and Dr. Vanderpool talks extensively about how he feels it should be labeled differently than post-traumatic stress disorder in adults. And these are the reasons why. When we have childhood trauma, it's happening during developmental phases of the brain, so it impacts the brain more. If we want to think about it as though when someone has a trauma that happens during development, say we think about it during preschool years, early childhood, 6-year-olds are pretty vulnerable. Anytime a brain is going through rapid development, which means whenever you're seeing your students go through a rapid growth phase, their brain is also going through a growth phase, and their brain is also more vulnerable. So it's very analogous to if there's been an earthquake, and then there's an aftershock. So the earthquake is the development, and aftershock is the traumatic event. A child may be fine or look fine as they develop, but they're more vulnerable during that developmental period, and then the trauma is going to maybe have things come down a bit. Also, because we're first developing our sense of safety and security with others, our sense of trust, our ability to attach to other people. When we have trauma in childhood, it's going to impact that trust. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. And finally, for each child, and as elementary educators, for each child, everything that happens is happening in a smaller history. We have bigger histories. Mine's really big. But we have different size histories. But for kids, each event looms larger in their own personal history. So if I have someone bully me on the bus, that is going to be a bigger event than if you were bullied as an adult, because you have many relationships you can think about. You have ways to context what happens that children don't have. So childhood trauma looms larger for kids. And it's highly individualized, and we can talk for a long time, if we had the time, to talk about these individualized factors. But you've probably seen children that maybe you have a sibling and they live in the same situation, and one seems to be okay and one's really struggling. And that's this kind of confluence of what they are, their temperament, their coping skills, their birth order, what they believe they should do, their previous experiences, many, many factors, and they bring that to the table, and that's going to impact how that event impacts them. I do a lot of work with kids from hard places that are trying to go to college, first in their generation, or first in their family going to college. And I see great variability across their siblings in terms of their ability to sort of bounce back, be resilient in the face of the things that they've endured. Okay, I'm going to ask you to do this one, but not by polling. I want you to think about a smell, that when you smell it, it transports you to another place or time. a very positive thing. So let's think positively. That's something we can just think. Is there anyone willing to share? Thank you.
Actually, I will just tell you, would you turn it up a little bit?
Oh,
Up here or whatever is.
I'm not sure how to turn it up. How will we turn it up? I apologize, I haven't been loud enough.
I'm the only one, I apologize.
No, that's okay. Well, while he's turning it up, if anybody wants to share a big voice, a smell, yes,
And
please.
Diane, maybe if you hold it a little closer too.
Okay. Is that better? Okay, I was trying not to get a reverb and I overcorrected. Yes, please.
Sawdust. Sawdust.
Sawdust.
Sawdust, okay, somebody say the same.
Industrial arts teacher, and he made beautiful furniture, and all that brings me back to being with my dad.
Okay, great, thank you. Another one.
Cinnamon.
Cinnamon.
My family made ornaments, and our whole family was productive with it, with cinnamon applesauce.
Ah, cinnamon and applesauce ornaments, wonderful, yes.
Safeguard soap.
Safeguard soap, okay.
My grandmother.
Grandmother, good, thank you.
Balsam fir.
Balsam fir. Okay. You know, we can think about those things, and when you smell them, you're not consciously saying, I want to be transported to thinking about my grandmother, but you're there. It's a visceral experience. It's a positive visceral experience, right? Trauma is a negative visceral experience. It lives in the emotional part of the brain, and it lives in the bone. So when our kids have trauma, it's not necessarily when they have a trigger or anything that suddenly has them change when our students experience that. It's not that they're trying to go there. It's impossible to not go there when they have those triggers. But there's more to trauma than just trauma triggers, particularly when we think about the fact that kids often will have childhood trauma as a result of those many little things rather than one big event. What that calls for us, anybody that supports children, to do is really understand that most of trauma lives below the surface, that we only see a little bit. As kids get older, they start having a story they can tell, and they might have what is often called kind of the cover story of their trauma. They'll be able to identify a few things, but that is not wholly sufficient to explain their trauma. And so most lives below the surface, and that requires us, if we're going to be able to support them completely, it requires us to ask new and different kinds of questions. It requires us to understand the physiology, to be able to reinterpret much of what we're seeing. And so we're going to go through these things, and I have strategies kind of lined up that are strategies you're probably already using many of them. But we can talk, when we talk about strategies, we'll be able to go deeper in terms of those kinds of things. But these are the questions we should be asking ourselves. Could it be this? Could this be the explanation for what I'm seeing behaviorally from a child? And then what is my response to that? I love this quote, for every problem there's a solution that's clear, simple, and wrong. And I've done plenty of wrong solutions in my educational career. I think we need to give ourselves some grace. And then when we figure out they're not working, we do something new, right? Okay, I'm going to skip by this because I want to get to the science. You know these things, you experience these things. A list of how kids manifest their trauma in classrooms. And I do want to just pay attention to the out-of-blue reactions, because we do think about trauma triggers, but they're really hard to detect. And many times when a kid kind of out of the blue shows behavior, has a real difficult moment, it's not so much that it's a trigger. It may be in some cases, and I've had some really interesting ones that I've experienced as an educator. But many times it's just an accumulation. So if we think about, and this is hard to do with the mic, but I'll do my best. If we think about that for any of us, we come to each day of our life kind of with a set point. It's where we are when we started the moment, started that day, started that time period. And we have some space, hopefully, in which we can function before we have our flip out point, our point where we're no longer the rational, delightful people that we intend to be when we started our day. And that throughout the day, and this is true for our kids, students too, our stressors will cause us to rise closer and closer to that flip out point. A lot of things, when we think about trauma-informed strategies, it's not a cure-all, there's not a panacea, but what we're trying to do is keep the kids that come here, all the way up here to us, or right up against their flip-up point, and do things that help to bring them down and away from it. Because in the space between your set point or your arrival point and your no longer rational person that you would hope to be point is the space to learn and connect. And the smaller it is, the harder it is for kids to do that. The more we can extend that. So let me give you a quick example. One school I worked with, they knew that an awful lot of their kids were really struggling. And so they posted 6 throughout the school so that every kid would run into 6 adults before they hit the classroom in the morning. And so the kids would come in and they had greeters. So I want you to just, if you're near someone, if not, I want you to just imagine it in your head. They had greeters that would greet these kids, but all it was, for the most part, was a smile. So turn to someone near you and give them a smile. If you've got a mask, smile with your eyes. It's okay. I'll smile with you, Chris.
Yeah.
All right, so what are you doing with a smile? So here's the science behind the smile. When you smile at somebody, genuinely, right, which shows in the eyes, when you smile with somebody, your body releases dopamine. It's a calming chemical. It helps us to be in a better place. It's the runner's high, etc. When you smile, when somebody smiles back at you, you get another little dose of dopamine. Dopamine pulls you away from your flip-out point. So they posted 6 people, and that was the plan, that kids would run into 6 people as they came in through the school door and moved to their classroom that would greet them with a smile. If they knew their name, they'd use that too. But they greeted them with a smile, and some of the greeters were really good at noticing little things about kids. That was a school-wide, tier 1 kind of trauma-informed practice that they did in order to help kids, every kid moving in that school, move away from that flip-out point. Now, there were some kids in that school that were here, and they made a little bit lower even, which is good. But the kids that really needed it were here, and it just gave that teacher, when they entered the classroom, a little bit of space with which to make progress, to connect with that kiddo, and do things that allow that child to kind of connect up and calm down and be able to function well. Okay, trauma triggers, we're going to skip this. So stress changes how we function at the moment. Pervasive trauma changes how parts of our brain relate to each other, and which ones are more robust and which are more faded out. But not, the good news is they can be reconnected, they can grow. And it changes like what we use first in our brain versus what we use later. This one's the one we're all really familiar with. When we have higher levels of cortisol in our brain, which is one of the stress chemicals, we feel more, think less. We see that all the time with kids, right? We're experiencing much greater emotions, and we're not able to resource our cognitive parts of our brain. Actually, the sugars that allow our brain to function drop from the cognitive part into the more emotional part. So it's harder to think. So that we understand, we experience that a lot, pretty common. You might already be doing lots of these things, so that creating safety in your classroom, soft landings, establishing a schedule, explaining the changes. Perhaps some of you have changed little icons you use to help kids navigate changes in the schedule. Those sorts of things. I won't be able to go through all of these, and I'll apologize, but I want to make sure you get a flavor for it and you can look at it. And I did include my email that if you look at something and you're really curious about it, you can drop me a note and we'll chat about it. When stress goes up in our brain and body, where our vision centers become more active and our auditory centers become less active. So if you've ever been really stressed and experienced that sort of tunnel or worrying, that's actually your auditory centers turning off. So this certainly means that we need to think about how much we use language when a kid is escalating, because it's not worth a lot. They literally don't hear trigger it. And if we kind of then tie that back to the cognitive parts of the brain shutting down, they can't process it if they didn't hear it. So you've got a double whammy. Their processing of it isn't so good and they're not really hearing it. Their vision centers are becoming much more active. And when our vision centers become more active, they also become active in a different way. So let me explain that. When they become more active, we take visual information in. But the more stress we get, the less we take in facial expressions, and the more we take in body language. So how you use your body is more important even than your face. I'm not saying forget your face, but things like, if I'm gonna walk up to a stressed kid, I'm not gonna, this overlaps with a lot of CPI training. If I'm gonna walk up, I'm not gonna walk up full front. I'm gonna be less imposing. I'm gonna try to come in smaller, lower, slower, because everything looks faster and bigger when I'm stressed out. It's adaptive, because if I read body language to tell what's going on and I'm feeling stressed, I can read that more 360. I can read it from a greater distance than I can facial expressions. But when I think about so many times I've tried to really work on my face so I have like a neutral responding calm face, and I realize like my body's giving me away because the tension is showing. So working on our body might be a really important thing in conjunction with thinking about our faces. It also tells us why we're successful when we use lots of visual supports. And so the more we can use visuals as we're working with kids, even not just to keep them from escalating, but the more a child whose brain is living more in the vision centers chronically, which is what trauma does, the more we can use visuals, whether it's writing something up on the board, using their own book to show the page to the rest of the class, giving them visual feedback that they're doing well. One of my favorite little visual kind of hacks that has been working really well in a lot of settings, but I thought it was only for elementary, and as I shared with the middle schoolers, kind of saying, middle school folks and high school folks, some of them decided to use it, even though I thought it was kind of an elementary thing, is the sign for waiting. And so when students come up to us and they are meeting us and their needs are big and fast, we often, if we're working with other kids, we're going to say, wait a minute, or we're going to give them a cue, I'll be with you in a minute. And the natural thing to do is this. The more tuned in our brain is to visual signals, the more we interpret body language in kind of a more primitive way. And anytime we see a hand like this, it is distancing. This isn't that far from it. It's still the palm towards the individual. And so switching to the sign for waiting and teaching kids that when you come up, if I'm working with somebody else, or if I'm in the middle of a thought, or I'm writing something to someone that I need to get done right then, I can give you the waiting sign, and it's a visual sign, and when we move our palm from this way to this way, it's much more inviting. It's not as distancing, it's not as escalating. And so doing that kind of wait sign and the active movement keeps the kids' visual centers on it. And it's a little thing, but most trauma-informed practices are about cobbling together little things that make a difference and creating greater space in which to work with kids. Our hippocampus, our working memory, tends to be negatively impacted. In fact, kids under chronic stressful situations have about a 20% smaller hippocampus. So see, horse-shaped portion of our brain responsible for lots of things, concretizing facts. So memorizing facts, cold memory is hard for kids with smaller hippocampus. It is working memory. It's also where our neutral and positive memories are stored. And so if we have a smaller hippocampus, it's harder for us to remember the good stuff of our life. So we want to bring that forward. How do we declare that? One thing is we make it more visual. So we have kids see things that declare who they are as a success rate. And so that hippocampus has a smaller working memory. We have, as adults, about 7 spots. Depending on the age of your kids, it can go down to about 2 by their age. And so a 6-year-old might have about 2 or 3 slots. You know this is why you chunk things and you only give directions in small portions. But if you have a 20% smaller working memory, we're going to have to chunk even smaller. Or we're going to have to provide a lot more visual support in order to be successful. The prefrontal cortex, we all know, is all about those executive skills, those skills that allow us to task initiate, task endure, delay gratification, manage our time, manage our materials. All of those skills are compromised by trauma. Both parts of these brains can regain and become stronger with experience because practice makes permanent. And so the more we use these parts of the brains with kids, the more we get them to use them, so the more we exercise them. When we ask responsive classroom questions like, you know, who can tell me how we should use our bodies when we move into the hallway? When we use those strategies, we pull up information. We're actually having kids think in organized ways and having them recall things. We actually are exercising that part of the brain that becomes stronger, which is exciting news. But these are compromised. What causes them to be compromised is under the presence of cortisol. Cortisol prevents these parts of the brain from any cell regeneration. It's why we don't want to, for many reasons, we don't want to have kids in elevated states of stress for long periods of time. Because that means cortisol's in there and it's stopping their brain from growing and being healthy. I've included a bunch of different options there. Part of, and this is an interesting thing, how many people have had kids lie to them? Okay. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, part of our prefrontal cortex, is the part of the brain that is responsible for memory, sequence, okay, and time understanding. If you have a lot of stress, this part of the brain goes offline. And a lot of us have experienced this, and I was visiting with a friend yesterday, and we were talking about how we've ended up dividing our life before COVID and after COVID. That a lot of times we found ourselves saying, I'm not sure when that happened. COVID, because of the stresses associated with it, so many of us have said, I can't keep hold of when something happened. I've lost sequence. That's because this part of our brain has gone offline due to the stress that we've been experiencing. And so for kids, when we ask them to retell us what happened, what just happened on the playground, what just happened in the hallway, they go to tell us that this is how memory is when your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex goes offline. It is like a fireworks explosion. So this is what, now some kids are straight up lying, I'm not gonna be naive, but a lot of kids when they're lying, this is what's happening. They're trying to construct from memory something that is not sequential. And they are going up into their memory in this scattered way that it exists.